Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, MysterE. So, MysterE, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. And I guess since we were discussing stories last time, we all rolling, and I thought I'd go into Robin Hood today. We can go through Robin Hood today, and actually, I was reading a book recently, "The Plunder of the Commons" by Guy Standing,
Yep.
and he actually was saying in it that the Robin Hood story was very contemporaneous to the Charter of the Forest.
Okay. Yep.
Once did a little bit of investigating, and this might actually come up in a future video essay of mine.
Ooh.
You can draw a lot of comparisons, which I found that was quite interesting.
Okay. So what is the Charter of the Forest then? We've talked about it before, but for all the listeners, I guess, that aren't acquainted with it, what is the Charter of the Forest, 4IS?
Okay, yes. I guess this is going to be a little bit of a redux episode to way back in episode 2, but the Charter of the Forest is basically a lesser known charter that was basically combined with the Magna Carta, and obviously Magna Carta, one of the most foundational charters or foundational like pieces of legislation, if you will.
Yeah, it's almost
for
like a
Britain.
constitution, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of Britain, but the Charter of the Forest was more specifically about the commoners' relationship to the land, or basically the land in general is what they called the forest.
Yeah.
And basically, it was the first time that the commoners had rights of subsistence, which was fairly revolutionary.
Yeah. So the Magna Carta being kind of a constitution between the king and his nobles, and like how they act towards each other, their responsibilities and obligations and all that sort of stuff. But the the Charter of the Forest was something to do with common ownership of certain lands within England. And
Correct.
it had to do with like the rights of the common people to be able to access and use those lands for their own benefit, and like completely unalienable rights to that land as well. So you couldn't have like, town sheriffs or bailiffs or the local authorities coming in there and stopping people using it the way that they want to use it to survive. That's what you mean by subsist, yeah?
Yes, and I guess we'll kind of get into the whole Sheriff of Nottingham aspect of this later on in the episode, but let's break down what we mean by forest, because because obviously because I think what's great about Robin Hood, after I kind of got these connections together, is that there's actually far more metaphor, or at least double meanings, that are within the Robin Hood legend than I kind of realized. And one aspect of it is obviously Sherwood Forest and the idea of the forest in general. Now, obviously, when people think of a forest, they think of woodland creatures and trees and nice big open spaces. But the funny thing about what the 12th and 13th century considered as a forest was just basically land for the commoners to exist. Basically, common areas. So this could be, this naturally could be your woodlands areas, but that also means land for the sheep and cattle to graze. It's like, for example, within the charter itself, it gives people rights in order to cut down branches of trees so they can use that for firewood, say, during the winter or that sort of thing. But also what it does is it enshrines the basically the traditions of the people within Britain itself. So you have, I think it was like eastover or eastering, which is basically the cutting down of the firewood. You have, fishing. You have the grazing. You have specific traditions such as letting your pigs eat the acorns within forest lands so they can kind of graze themselves.
Yeah.
And what's great, basically, the historical context of the reason why the Charter of the Forest existed is, well, King John, or I guess in the Robin Hood story, Prince John,
Yeah.
is enclosing more and more of this forest or
Yeah.
the common land. And it was getting to the stage where basically they were pissing off the commoners because they were, they were destroying all of their dikes, their houses, and all of that. And it got to the stage where the commoners were like, "Okay, you need to stop doing this, and you need to basically give us rights."
Yeah.
And from that, King John and I guess, also. King Richard and all of that, because like it has this very long opening at the start of the Charter of the Forest of the layers of authority that give access to it,
Yeah.
and it basically enshrines the right to subsist.
Yeah.
And you can basically see the influence of this charter on the Robin Hood story, and really you don't have to take my word for it, because let's take an example of Article 12 within the Charter of the Forest.
Yeah.
Every freeman from henceforth without danger shall make in his own wood or on his land or on his water which he has within our forest, mills, springs, pools, mole pits, dikes, or arable ground, without enclosing that arable ground, so that it be not to the annoyance of his neighbours.
Interesting.
But what's interesting about that quote is it's not only about your right to
just having free access to plunder and exploit the land. It's
not just about that, but it's also about being a steward, because you couldn't just do anything with the land.
Yeah.
You had to make sure that you were only taking as much as you need, because this is another interesting part that Guy Standing actually says within the Plunder of the Commons, is that the word waste had a very different meaning back then compared to now.
Yeah.
So obviously when you think of waste nowadays, you think, maybe unnecessary plastic packaging, and you kind of throw it in the rubbish tip and that sort of thing. But the idea of waste back in the 12th and the 13th century in Britain was actually, you take the necessary branches or the necessary acorns for your pigs, and the waste, the excess of the forest that you don't need, you let that replenish in that area, and you move on to another area.
So it's just like additional or surplus.
Yes.
This waste. It's not actually waste in like a sense that it can't be used by anyone. It's stuff that is additional to what you actually need, and so it should be left over, either for regeneration purposes. Or for other people to use. And so I think that's a really important part of that article that you just read out then.
Yeah.
That it's kind of communal, or it's very communal in the sense that like it shouldn't be done to the annoyance of any of your neighbors. So you shouldn't be encroaching on anyone else's rights to be able to use this common area. So you need to use it responsibly, which is an important kind of theme there. It's rather revolutionary for the times by the sounds of it. And two, it's rather communistic, isn't it? It's like about that general principle, each according to their needs, and like, you're taking what you need, but you also there's a level of ownership there. And so like if you've got the ability to leave stuff for other people, then you've got to be able to do that, and you don't take more than what you need, and that type of kind of communal thinking and social thinking
Yeah.
is important for sustainability purposes, something which we struggle with today, and something which is central to the idea of waste in modern society is the question of sustainability and whether or not we're
Yeah.
living in tune with nature. And it seems like the Charter of the Forest is a clear acknowledgement of like our connection to the natural world and our need to not only use it for our own ends, but also to preserve it and make sure it's there for other people / future generations, which is something that we're completely detached from, I would say, here in the 21st century.
Oh, most certainly. And I guess the importance of this kind of redux episode, if you will, is well, look, I'm happy to put up my hand. Of episode 2, I misunderstood what Garrett Harding said in the tragedy of the Commons because I had misinterpreted at the time that he was talking about
Mm,
big corporations and
mm,
their interaction with the world is what kind of creates what we would consider externalities or
yeah.
waste of what we would consider. But
Mm,
what he was actually saying is he was basically removing an individual's understanding of taking away from the commons, and he completely disregards the stewardship aspect of it.
yeah.
Of
Yeah.
he basically makes a full set of premises and conclusions that, well, if everyone takes their fair share, then there's eventually going to be a slippery slope of
Mm,
you're
mm,
going to take more and more and more away from the lands until
yeah.
suddenly there is no commons anymore.
Yeah.
But it's completely devoid from the spirit of the charter that was of the time, which was,
Mm,
yeah, you take what you need, but also you realize that you are a steward of the land and that
mm,
you make sure that there is enough surplus or
mm.
waste, as they would call it, for the land to replenish itself. So
Yes.
once you graze for a certain period within an area with your cattle, you move on to the next area
Mm,
because that was the custom, that was the tradition, and you
yes.
go from there.
Yes. And I think it's important, yeah, like you were saying before, to qualify or quantify what the forest is. And the forest is not just, like you said, like the woods or something like that. It extends to all the natural features of the land which are there or not there primarily, but are able to support the common way of life.
Mm.
So, like you said, if you have grand pastures and open fields and things like that, they're considered under the Charter of the Forest, and people will use that to, like you said, graze livestock.
Mm.
But like the one of the essential things I think, especially for this point in time and before you get into industrial society, is like getting access to firewood. It's not only just important for cooking and things like that, but for places which go through harsh winters, it's essential for heating. And like without heating, people freeze and die. And so like being able to get access to firewood or charcoal and things like that is essential to their way of life. And if like people are being closed off from that or using it in an unsustainable manner, then like it completely undermines the way that society works at that point. And so like, and that goes from, just those kind of elements within the forest or like vegetation and stuff like that to water bodies and water courses. So they're talking about like dikes and areas which are like, I guess, isolated water bodies. It would have included streams and rivers and all that sort of stuff too, because people would have used that for their water sources, but also, for fishing, like you said before. And so, like, it's kind of broad reaching. It basically is a charter of the natural environment to ensure that one, it's not overused, and two, it's basically there for all to enjoy. And no one should have any kind of right or claim over it more than anyone else. And so, inherently, from that right of access, that means there's a level of equity or equality about using and relating to the land, something which is like, completely void in a capitalist society.
Yes.
Capitalism is all about the exploitation of the natural world in order
Mm.
to serve market intentions, even if it's not like, directly taking a resource to then turn it into something else to be sold on the market. It could just be basically laying claim to an entire environment or ecosystem in order to pillage that directly and then just transfer that straight onto the market. So there's a complete detachment there from this understanding that the natural world is there for all and all should have equitable access to it, which is, like the Charter of the Forest is really then some hyper progressive stuff. And if the people, like commoners, like peasants and, medieval English people, were able to figure that out and lay claim to it and understand that this was crucial for their way of life, then like, how backwards are we today for AS if we can't put two and two together and understand that, like, our natural world to a certain extent can be exploited? Yes, okay, but as long as it's being used in a responsible manner. If commoners from, like honestly, people that thought the earth was flat and like, the sun revolved around the earth, like if those people could have put two and two together and say, hey, we need to be able to do this in a way where everyone can get access to it and we don't screw it up for anyone else, then like what are we doing today for IS? Like honestly, like
Well, see, you used a very good term there back there. You were using the idea of transfer of wealth, and this is actually integral to the Robin Hood story.
okay.
Because what a lot of people also don't realize with the Charter of the Forest is that, well, the Charter basically enshrined its own justice system.
Yeah, right.
Which we'll get into, but I think that's the. But I kind of want to discuss first the idea of transfer of wealth, or the idea that the commons or the forest had its own public wealth. Because when you have all these traditions and everything, this is the second, I believe, double meaning that the Robin Hood story has, which involves, of course, the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah.
And I think, like, let's take the fable of the Robin Hood Disney story into consideration. Like, let's look at Sherwood Forest, which Robin Hood and Little John and the Merry Men are existing in. It's nice, lush, and green. And then you compare that to Nottingham itself, the city, which is very desolate, very poor. And there's a big focus on, Prince John and his advisor going around in horse and carriage and basically hoarding all of these coins from taxes.
Yeah.
Now, the sheriff going around and taking all the taxes from the poor people, I not only, like, don't get me wrong, I think it's very possible and almost a certainty that King John and King Richard around that time would have been doing taxes. I don't think I think that's very self-explanatory, but I think the idea of the taxes within themselves also is a metaphor towards the enclosure acts that were happening around that time, because I think what they were saying in the book with Guy Standing is that what used to be like at the start of the William the Conqueror in 1066, leading all the way to 12 I think it's 1255 for when the Charter of the Forest was enshrined. What started off as like 1,000 like common forests whittled it all the way down to like 200 and something.
Yeah, right.
And like that progressive, like 2 centuries worth, it was basically the king and his subjects, in terms of the royal court, like slowly squeezing the commoners of their land, because they realized that, having, like, increasing the royal forests and enclosing them actually did increase wealth for them, because they could get access to the game and all of the necessary resources that the forests had. And that was basically a transfer of public wealth to the private coffers. So I think that's the reason why, say for example, the Disney version of the story, the the city of Nottingham is so poor and desolate because there has been that enclosing of people's public wealth.
Yeah, they've been cut
Now,
off from their means of existence
yeah,
and their
subsistence.
culture, by the sounds of it too.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, because really, I think there's this scene where Robin Hood eventually like saves them all, and they kind of all come back to the forest, and it's this massive party because suddenly they have gained access to the forest again, and it's this big party. But I also think the sheriff within the Robin Hood story is very important as well, and him like forcing and squeezing the taxes out of everyone, because this is another article within the Charter of the Forest, Article 16, which is also important, which reads, "No constable, chatelain, or bailiff shall hold plea of forest, neither for greenhew nor hunting. But every forester in fee shall make attachments for pleas of the forest as well for greenhew as hunting, and shall present them to the viziers of the provinces. And when they be enrolled and enclosed under the seals of the viziers, they shall be presented to our chief justices of our forest, when they shall come into those parts to hold the pleas of the forest, and before them they shall be determined." Now, I'm going to break that down, but the two important words in that are to keep in mind is the viziers and the chief justices.
Yeah.
Now, what this Article 16 actually points out is that there's already a justice system that the Charter of the Forest has established, because naturally, in this kind of right to subsist system, there are going to be disputes between commoners. And this is where the viziers come in, which are basically the custodians of the forest. So these are basically officials that if there's any disputes, because I think there's another article in this that's like, hey, if there's any disputes, in this time in spring we're going to hold court, or in this time in autumn we're going to hold court. And you basically, as a first port of call, you visit the viziers, and they basically sit down with the commoners in the court and try and work out a compromise, or at least a resolution to any sort of disputes that happen.
They arbitrate.
Yes, they arbitrate. And if it needs to go up a level, that's when the chief justices come in. But more importantly, you can have the justice system of the justice actors of the king himself, which the constables, the bailiffs, and all of that, the sheriffs, like the Sheriff of Nottingham, but they shall not interact with the jurisdiction of the viziers and the chief justices. Never the two shall meet, and that's why the Sheriff of Nottingham is kind of the bad guy in the Robin Hood story, is that he's basically he's moving beyond his jurisdiction by taxing the wealth from the commoners. And it wasn't until I read this charter that, there's quite a lot of metaphor in the Robin Hood story.
Yeah, so that's more like an allegory then for them, like not just taxing them, in the usual sense for whatever goods they produce as peasantry or commoners and things like that. That is then, let's say, reappropriated or expropriated for the state at its purposes. But you're actually meaning it's more than that, and it was a metaphor for actually them enclosing common lands and taking away people's access to their actual livability and their ability to actually survive and have their cultural practices and all that sort of stuff. So it's twofold. It's not just the literal taxing other people through in a monetary sense. It was also taking away public wealth.
Yes, and this is why in the Robin Hood story, the phrase "stealing from the rich to give to the poor" is really important, because it wasn't necessarily that Robin Hood was l- literally stealing coins from the
Mm,
purse of Prince John and giving it to the poor.
yeah.
It was more the commoners and
Mm,
their
their struggle.
figurehead, their symbolic hero, Robin
Yeah.
Hood, was helping them dismantle the enclosure laws in
Yeah.
order for them to gain back their public wealth.
Yeah. And so like
Which,
effectively then like the forest and like in this type of sense the forest, not just like like a woodland area, like literally this
mm,
forest, all these natural resources, then it's kind of like an autonomous zone then. So like once you enter into that area, there's no power that the state has or the authority has any jurisdiction over, and people are able to exist in there. And if like there are any disputes, then they have to figure it out within their own kind of hierarchies and their own systems and stuff like that. And they have that set out and planned already. So
yeah,
like they can
yeah,
autonomously act basically in this area. If there are disputes, it's figured out locally
yeah.
and by certain means, but it's all done by the people. So it's basically like an anarchistic kind of way of running um, public areas.
Yeah, which really Article 16 really fascinates me because it's almost as if it's like a co-determination thing
Yeah.
where
Yeah, there's like
where
two branches of there's two systems going on in medieval England, basically.
yeah,
They have one
where
kind of rule for how you exist in kind of the public realm that's like, resided over by the king and the nobility. And then you have another rule for like how you exist out in nature and how you relate
mm,
to the world at large. It's very, very interesting. And like that is some crazy and like perplexing,
mm,
um, like kind of that's a perplexing reality for people living in the 21st century that the reach of the state does not or only goes up to a certain point within like a country or a nation or something
mm,
like that. And after there are certain areas where it has no power. It'd be like,
mm,
for Australians like going to the national parks around them and there being no one having jurisdiction over that area. And you could basically effectively use the parks at your leisure as long as you're not destroying or laying waste
mm,
to, in the modern sense, laying waste
mm,
to those areas. And like you're using them responsibly, and there's no one that has power over you there, unless obviously there is an issue between you and somebody else that's trying to use it and enjoy it,
mm,
and then that needs to be decided upon by some type of local measure, as opposed to any kind of external source that bears down on top of you and the way that you want to use it. There's
mm,
something else that you were talking about in there as well, in terms of like a trope that's used in Robin Hood tales. And while I haven't seen the Disney version that you're talking about, there's like a common kind of understanding in the closure of the forest and like these
mm.
kind of public assets, and you're not allowed to hunt in the king's forest, and that's like kind of
Yes.
a common theme that comes up. And so all game is the property of the king, etc., etc. And like one of the things that Robin Hood does in a number of the versions of the tale out there is, when he confronts Prince John, he, comes into his hall when he's having some party or celebration,
Mm,
and he's got a deer.
yes.
Slung over his shoulders, and he, throws it on the table in front of Prince John, or however he enters the room, and that's like kind of a direct violation and like a direct kind of affront to those kind of rules against the public or the common use of those
Mm,
lands. And so if people have access to it, I thought that was just a stunning scene, and like, it was just, kind of just played up for some type of dramatic emphasis. Okay, you said we can't hunt here, but like, ha ha ha, I'm going to do it anyway, and they're going to shove it in your face, and bring something as a present to you at your little celebration, as just like a general FU to the system. But it's more than that. that's
Mm.
also kind of a metaphor for like regaining and retaking ownership of resources that are technically yours anyway. It's got
Yeah,
nothing to do with just, an FU to the system, like it is, but like it's also got to do with like I have a right to do this, and like, I've gone hunting and here's what I've done. So, how do you like it?
yeah, it's basically a callback to the
Mm,
enclosures that
yeah.
you're saying, and that I guess in that trope, Robin Hood is saying, "No, I'm allowed to get game
Mm,
because it's for common use,
yeah, it
and
belongs to us
I'm
all.
entitled to this. And the fact that I'm giving you this deer shows that I am entitled to do so."
Yes, yes, yeah.
And but I thought at first that maybe this Article 16 was a bit of an anomaly during it, but then there's actually later articles that it's like the system for the common land or the forest is seems to be completely different from what is under royal decree, because there's a very specific article that's in it that's basically like, oh yeah, and if somebody takes more than what they're supposed to, rather than having their arm chopped off,
Yeah.
maybe they'll be imprisoned for a certain period,
Mm,
or if they do something really bad, they'll be banished from the forest.
yeah.
But
Yeah. That's
like,
interesting, isn't it?
there's a very specific article that's like, yeah, maybe we don't get rid of a man's livelihood by chopping off
Yeah,
his arm.
yeah.
Maybe we
Which
do something
is
a
in
bit more
stark
humane.
contrast. It's in stark contrast and contradiction to typical laws of that time, which is all like corporal
Mm,
punishments and like, literally dismembering people for doing stuff. You
mm.
don't pay a certain thing, you lose an ear, or you lose a hand and stuff, which renders someone useless in
Yeah,
that day and age, like because your body is your mechanism to survive, and like your source of labor,
mm.
which like you said, allows you a certain level of subsistence or allows you to subsist at all. And so like certain punishments were about like basically rendering people useless. And like this kind of punishment is more like, well, you're supposed to use this responsibly, you haven't done so, so like you're out. You got 10 minutes over there, in the corner to think about it. So like it's more of a humane approach to
Mm.
punishment and making people kind of reflect, on the ways that they might have, um, negatively or erroneously used what is effectively a public asset. So
Yeah,
I think it's much more, commensurate with kind of the use of a public good. You've got
yes,
to, be responsible, and if you don't do it properly, then you're not allowed to have access to it anymore for a certain time period, which would be, a very just way of looking at the destruction and the exploitation of the natural world in a capitalist system,
Mm.
because you have a lot of kind of corporations, especially, or private capitalists, let's call them, that completely will lay waste, to a certain environment. So and like like when I say like lay waste, like there it is, it's gone.
Mm.
Like and it's probably polluted too, so it's not coming back. Even if you left it, certain decades or whatever to try and regenerate, it's probably polluted and it's never coming back, kind of thing. So like if you were to able to regulate that in any way and say, all right, well then you've lost your license or you can't practice your business anymore or forever as a result of this, people might change their relationship dramatically
Mm.
to the way, that they exploit and use natural resources, as opposed to just getting like a fine, a slap on the wrist, or like losing a hand. Like there's nothing that's relative in that type of punishment. It's got nothing to do with the actual use of that and like how the crime relates to the use of a public asset, which I just feel like today we just don't have enough regulation around that, especially when it's, in a kind of neo-colonial slash imperialistic sense, where you have like kind of first world or developed nations preying on undeveloped nations and exploiting them for their natural resources and just laying waste to communities and stuff like that in order to get access to their natural resources. And they have absolutely no connection to the land, and then they take absolutely no responsibility for its rehabilitation. after the fact, after they've exploited the resource. They just kind of leave it as a wasteland, and they're on to the next business venture.
Yes, because I think what's important with what you said there, I want to kind of drag out 2 points. One of them is, well, kind of what you were discussing lastly there is that, well, there's no relationship. Like, basically, the whole idea, which is what the Charter of the Forest actually established, was there's no stewardship to the land. So, because everything is about the profit and loss in the balance sheet, um, basically the second point that I want to make is that, like, externalities haven't been addressed properly. So, because you have a lack of stewardship and you're not really treating externalities properly. So, for example, I think Guy Standing actually goes into the book that I'm reading is Thames Water, which was basically a private company that took over the public water system when it was privatized. And one of the things it did back in, I think it was either 2011 or 2012, is that it was dumping sewerage into the into like the sea, or sorry, basically the Thames and all of that. And like what they were finding was, like, yeah, sewerage and like tampons and everything was basically going to the Thames River and stuff
Lovely.
like that. And all they got was a slap on the wrist, so a fine that they could very easily pay, and it was actually cheaper for them to get that fine rather than to actually correct their regulatory systems. So by only giving them the fine, it almost as if incentivized them to keep on doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, like there's this interesting kind of, I guess you would call it, social experiment, right? Where they at a childcare center or I think it was after school care. Let's just call it like childcare of some form. And so 6 p.m. was the pickup time, and so parents are supposed to be there at 6 p.m. to pick up their children. And if they're late, there's kind of like this understanding that like they shouldn't be late. They should pick them up at 6, because then like childcare workers have got to stay back to kind of look after these kids. And so like, every now and again you'd have kind of a parent rocking up late, and it'd put out the childcare worker because they've got other stuff to do, but someone's got to stay around and look after the kids. And so the childcare centre like kind of thought up a plan and said, look, well, you know what, let's put a price on this to incentivize it, so to stop people from rocking up late. Let's say it's going to cost them an extra $20 for every half an hour or 15 minutes that they're late. And so they thought that this like was a genius plan, and people would just stop rocking up late because they won't want to spend $20 extra for another 15 minutes or something. And what they found was, as soon as they put a price on it, people started to actually make a value choice. And they were just like, oh, look, instead of rushing there to get there at 6 o'clock, which is not going to happen for me, maybe I'll just take my time and I'll pay the extra $20. So people's rates of like pickup after 6 o'clock actually increased because people were putting a monetary figure on it. And so they were weighing up themselves, oh, yeah, I can afford that $20 for an extra 15 minutes, an extra $40 for an extra half an hour. Like, who cares? What's $40 for me? So some parents couldn't afford that, but the ones that could were just like, oh, they can stay there till 6:30 then. I don't care. So what's an extra $40 to me? So it had the reverse effect. It actually, then they started seeing the fact that people were just like not picking up their kids for much later. And so it was really putting the childcare workers out, because then they just had to stick around and look after kids, and a lot more of them, when people actually had to take and be responsible and rock up at the right time. Yes, there were anomalies. Yes, there were extenuating circumstances, but people started to just make a value choice in a market system, which was like, yeah, I'll pay for that. Why not? And like, that's a prime example. You have a public or utility which is taken over by private hands, and like they're obviously doing the wrong thing, but the fine itself, like the penalty for doing something that is obviously morally and as well as environmentally damaging is like just weighed up as another cost. And it's like, like you said, it's probably cheaper to just pay the fine than to actually properly dispose and treat raw sewage. It's just like after the Royal Commission into the banks here in Australia, like they would have weighed up their choices. They were doing some, nefarious. They had nefarious banking practices, which probably, like won them billions of dollars over the time it was that they were doing all of these things that they shouldn't have been doing. And then by the time at the end of the Royal Commission, they got like a $700 million fine or something like that, which should have been apparently $7 billion worth of fines. But they cut it down to 10% of what it was supposed to be. And they got a $700 million slap on the wrist. In the meantime, though, they've rorted the system, they've broken the law, and they probably, reaped profits well in excess of $700 million. But the question is, if you're looking at it from that business perspective, like you said on the balance sheet, that was good business. That's good business.
Well, yeah, and which brings us back to probably the tragedy of the commons, because it's looking at the general society and the resource that is there, without taking into consideration the stewardship aspect of it. So, yes, the tragedy of the commons does make sense if you don't consider stewardship. Because the aspect of externalities suddenly comes into the picture, and oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But as soon as you bring the idea of stewardship into it, and suddenly people have a moral responsibility in order to, take only what they need and then move on.
Yeah.
Then suddenly the tragedy of the commons has no moral weight to it.
Yeah. There's no implication to it anymore when people aren't just seen as automatons that are just like, I must use, as much as I can kind of thing and screw everybody else. Once there is a level of understanding that there is like kind of an inter-subjectivity about this, like a level of cooperation that like this resource is, if it is exploited, it's not just going to affect me, it's going to affect other people. So we all need to coordinate our approach to this. There is a lack of collaboration and a coordination to this idea of the tragedy of the commons, and like people are just inevitably and inherently greedy and like only ever think about like their own needs and their own gains at all times and stuff like that. I think this Charter of the Forest is kind of exemplifies the acknowledgement that people are directly kind of related and dependent on the land or like the earth to exist. And so by acknowledging that, we have to understand that if we're not at least responsible for it in some way, we shouldn't just screw it over completely. And like once you screw over a resource, then like, that's it. It's pretty much lost, especially one like a forest, which is a natural environment that like it needs to be pristine to a certain extent for it to be of any value to us. So like if you pump a river full of sewage, like, you're not like, you don't just cut the sewage and direct it somewhere else and then everything's going to be okay in the river. Like there will be a significant period of time, questionably ever, where you won't be able to use it. Like for generations, it might be displaced and inaccessible to other people. And like apart from just, killing the wildlife and destroying the whole ecosystem, like it'll just not be accessible for other people. And like I do think today we don't have a really good understanding of how that works. I think there's a complete disconnect, and I think it's because of the nature of capitalism in itself. Like it's just it opens, like Marx would say, like it opens the world up to the marketplace. Like nothing is left untouched. No corner of the globe goes unchecked by the reach of the invisible hand of the market, to mix some talkers there, some political economists. Like nothing is sacred. Nothing. And like this
Okay.
Charter of the Forest really takes the time to try and make things sacred,
Yes.
I think. And there's a lot of importance in that.
Yeah. And you know what? With that, I think that's a good note to end on. And as always, lastly, what's that synthwave art? So this week the prompt was Robin Hood protecting the forest and the charter. And it gave a very typical picture of Robin Hood, but I find it very interesting that he's using a branch as a sword, which
and he doesn't have a bow. Is that right?
Yeah, I was fascinated by that.
Yes.
That unless the branch behind him is supposed to be his
the bow slung over him somehow, but I can't see anything that would insinuate that. It looks more like a spear or something.
Yeah, but I thought it got 90% of his likeness, but what was missing was the bow, which I found quite interesting.
Yes, very interesting selection there. Old AI system. Why did you exclude that feature? Some things we will never know for IS.
No.
And maybe they are better that way. Maybe it's a mystery. I'll just put it out there.
I see what you did there.
Thank you very much for IS.
And with that, remember everyone to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, MysterE.
Thank you very much for IS. And to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.